Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program Beyond Kerbol. This episode has been quite a while in the making. It has taken weeks to design, test and launch all of the craft that I'm using in this video, but we are finally here, finally doing it, building a floating colony over a gas giant and then landing an aircraft on it. Not just any gas giant, in fact. We're going to Heber, which is the innermost planet of the Valentine system, which is 20 times the mass of Joule and twice the radius, because apparently I hate myself. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what we're getting up to today, I want to have a little chat about something. Now, the series has been blowing up a bit, pretty much ever since we went Interstellar, which is great. I've been getting lots of really kind words saying how much all of you are enjoying the series, and for the first time ever, I've been receiving fan art, which is amazing. We've got this one by Caps Lock, this one by Potato with a Naginata, and then I've got a 19-page long comic strip made for me by Scandinavian 101. I'll put a link to it in the description. He made an Imga album for it, and this thing is amazing. Like it's like the adventures of Bob Kerman, and it features Lowness terrorists trying to blow up the Clark, and it's incredible. I won't spoil it for you. Be kind, because English isn't his native language, but I think it's incredible. He sent it to me. He was a little bit shy, saying, "Oh, you know, you just like it." I'm like, "This is amazing!" Incredible. I've never had anything like this. So, you know, if you guys want to keep sending me fan art, then, you know, these things absolutely made my day. So, yeah, I honestly didn't even have words when I saw that comic strip. I thought, wow. That must have taken so much time and effort. It really, really means a lot. Anyway, enough of me freaking out about receiving my first sort of batch of fan art. Let's get on to what we're doing today. So we launched the IEV Asimov, our cargo condor. We're launching building supplies, so material kits and specialized parts up to the Clark, because we need to make a few modifications. We need to transport about 8,000 tons worth of cargo consisting of fuel and, of course, building materials in order to construct this floating colony and actually get it down into the atmosphere of Heber. So yeah, it's going to be quite a few supply trips up to it. And what I'm actually doing is I'm doing one flight with each of the different cargo loads and then using USI's logistics system to manufacture a thing called transport credits. You manufacture them with material kits, liquid fuel and oxidizer, all of which of course we're producing on our base on Fust Weir colony, in fact is what it's called. I had to actually remember what I named my damn colony for a second there. And so what I'm doing, as I said, is I'm just recording one flight, so there's 3 separate flights. And then the rest of them I'm just going to automate, because otherwise it would have been 150 cargo runs. And yeah, I mean, I had enough complaints about how long this episode took to make without doing 150 flights in order to fuel up the Clark. You see here, just heading in for our landing. There's the one that was a little bit more finicky. The cargo condor is a little bit more unwieldy than the crew condor, a little bit more difficult to land, but after a little bit of finagling we managed to bring it down onto the landing pad with a little bit of a bump, but thankfully still all in one piece. There we are. Lemor Kerman, our rather practiced cargo pilot at this point. And then, of course, as usual, we get Don Free out to go and connect up the fuel line and get it fueled up with carbon dioxide again. So then we basically just continued sending supply missions using transport credits to just automatically send up the material kits and specialized parts and continually refill the tanks aboard the Clark. And now we need to start building a bunch of fuel tanks, because yeah, we don't have enough storage on the Clark. We need, God, I had it somewhere. I wrote down the ridiculous amount of resources we need. Yeah, we need about 700,000 material kits, about 40,000 specialized parts, 200,000 units of oxidizer and 200,000 units of liquid fuel, and then about 3 million units of liquid carbon dioxide. Yeah, we're working with some big numbers today. So these first 2 tanks are the material kits and specialized parts tanks. So they are going to contain all of the building materials we need in order to construct our floating colony, and of course the little shuttle, I say little, the pretty massive shuttle that we need in order to transport fusion pellets up from the floating colony. Perhaps I should go over why we're actually building this. A lot of people have been like, Beardy, what on earth are you doing? What? Why are you doing this? We need fusion fuel for all of our fusion reactors. So we need helium-3 and we need deuterium. And the easiest way to get that is from the atmosphere of a gas giant. Could I have just dipped into the upper atmosphere and harvested it? Yes. Would that have been as amazing as building a floating colony? Hell no. So I decided to set myself this challenge. Honestly, when I set myself this, I didn't even know if it was possible. And it turns out this was right on the very limit of the most advanced technology available to us with KSP Interstellar. So yeah, you can see why it took about 4 weeks to get this episode out, because about 3 weeks of that was just designing the shuttle, actually getting that to work, because orbital velocity over Heber is 19 kilometers per second. So if you think that's easy, think again. Anyway, so we've got the IEV Asimov coming up again. So the last flight we sent up material kit specialized parts and actually topped up the fertilizer stores on board the Clark to make sure it can produce enough supplies for the trip. And this time we are just carrying liquid carbon dioxide, which is the fuel for the shuttle, which will be heading down to the colony and coming back up with its bountiful supplies of fusion pellets. I say bountiful, it's going to be transporting 2 tons of fusion pellets at a time, because yeah, our margins, our delta V margins are very, very narrow. That will be a little bit later on the episode. And once again, bringing the Asimov back down. So now we need to transport up a bunch of liquid fuel and oxidizer, which is what we're going to be using to deorbit the floating colony, because there is no air braking on Heber. You slam into the upper atmosphere at 19 kilometers per second and you immediately explode. Okay, there's no skimming the atmosphere to slow down, as many people were, people were trying to help me in the Discord, to be fair, but I don't think many of them quite grasped the enormity of this task. One guy was like, oh, Beardy, why don't you put some vector engines on your craft, get a bit more thrust to weight? And I'm like, I'm using antimatter engines and it's not enough. Like, anyway. And you see here, we had to actually build a third condor, because as I said, we need to transport up the liquid fuel and oxidizer for the floating colony. And I named this the IEV Wells, of course, after H.G. Wells, the one of the original greats of science fiction writing. And we're sending Lemore over to pilot it, and then Katrina Kerman to get in, because, of course, if you think Katrina Kerman is going to miss a chance to pilot our brand new shuttle, which is going to head down into the upper atmosphere of a gas giant and land on a tiny floating platform, yeah. She has to be the Kerbol to do that. I mean, she is, to be fair, the only Kerbol for the job. We need an experienced level 5 pilot, otherwise they'll just pass out from the G-forces, because they're gonna get knocked about quite a bit. Anyway, we blast ourselves back up into orbit. I believe it took about, it's about 50 flights of building materials. It took about 43 flights to transport all the CO2 and about 30 flights of the wells in order to ship up all of the liquid fuel and oxidizer. You see here we're just docking with the Clark, transfer it into those massive fuel tanks, hardly making a dent in their total storage, and then of course transferring Katrina over onto the Clark, ready to to basically do probably the most bonkers thing I have ever done in Kerbal Space Program. Definitely the most difficult thing I've ever done in Kerbal, to be fair. Besides winning a war in it, a few times that I did that. Anyway, deorbiting once again, and we're just going to cut out most of the re-entry and everything, because you've seen 2 of these flights already. So once again, heading down onto the landing pad at Weir Colony. The third landing pad, so they're now all nicely populated, and then connecting it up and getting it refueling, ready for another flight. Although we're not going to be shipping anything up into space for a little while yet. So we plan our maneuver out to Heber, and we are now, after a bunch of resupplies, all fueled up and ready to go. 8,000 tons of assorted fuel and building materials. Yeah, thank God the Daedalus engine is as efficient as it is. And of course, it's actually fueled by fusion pellets itself, so we need to make sure that we bring enough fuel for the shuttle that we can net more fusion pellets than it actually costs to make the trip. It ends up costing about 40,000 fusion pellets in order to make the trip, which is about 8 tons or so. And we're going to be able to make 10 trips down to the surface with the amount of CO2 we're bringing along. Although with the return trip, if you think about it, we're not going to be carrying 8,000 tons of cargo, so it won't cost anywhere near as many fusion pellets to come back. And then subsequent trips, we will have to make multiple trips out to Heber and back in order to fuel up on carbon dioxide. We can only take a certain amount this time because, of course, we have to have all the building materials and liquid fuel as well. But we will be able to fuel up the Clark doing this. But yeah, it's going to take quite a bit of time. But I'm only going to do this mission profile once. Similar to all of our other resupply missions. Once I've shown that I can do it one time, I'm more than happy letting USI automate things and just save me a fair bit of time so I can focus on the interesting things, like visiting new planets, doing new things. But yeah, when, doing the resupply missions actually involves doing new things, that's when things get really cool. Honestly, I don't think anyone has ever done this before. I know people have built floating colonies over Jool. I don't think anyone's ever built a floating colony over Heber, but I don't think anyone's even landed anything on a Jool colony before. It's the most ridiculous idea. I think only I could have come up with it. Only I could be stupid enough to come up with it. But there it is in all of its glory. Heber, as I said, 20 times the mass of Jool. If this thing was 4 times larger, it would be a brown dwarf. It's 1% the mass of Valentine. I mean, it must be causing a lot of Doppler shift on Valentine. They'll both be orbiting around their combined center of mass. I'm just wondering if the barycenter, the center point that they both would orbit around, would be outside the surface of Valentine. I mean, obviously it isn't modeled that way, but in reality, with a planet this big, orbiting this close to a small red dwarf, it's certainly gonna make some kind of impact. Anyway, you see here we are finally making our deceleration burn, or should I say the first deceleration burn. It is going to take many burns. It took quite a few burns to get our original encounter, but now we're having to get down into orbit around this behemoth of a planet. It is going to take a lot of passes, especially with the low thrust to weight ratio of this engine. Well, to be fair, the engine itself produces quite a bit of thrust, but the craft weighs 8,500 tons, so obviously it's going to take quite a bit of time to decelerate that much mass. It is a really cool looking planet though. It's a hot Jupiter sort of type of planet, a very large gas giant orbiting in close to its star, seemingly the most abundant planets in the universe, but obviously that data is quite skewed because they're also the easiest exoplanets to spot because they're massive and they orbit very close to their stars. So the majority of exoplanets we found are hot Jupiters, but again, as I said, that data is probably skewed because they are so easy to find. So we don't really know yet until, well, at least until, the James Webb Space Telescope goes up and we get some slightly more focused exoplanet data. The James Webb Space Telescope is actually going to be able to analyze the spectra of light going through exoplanets' atmospheres, so we can figure out what the constituents of exoplanet atmospheres are, which is amazing. Although I don't think it's going up for another couple of years yet. I mean, originally it was supposed to go up in 2018. I think it got delayed to 2020, and now with the current situation and everything, I think it might be delayed to 2021, probably 2022. But they've got to get this right. You can't have a repeat of Hubble, have it launch and have it not work, especially considering James Webb is going into quite high orbit. It's going out to a Lagrange point, quite far away from Earth. So if it gets out there and it doesn't work, we're a bit stuffed. You'd have to send an Orion capsule out there to fix it. But I don't think, we just hopefully just won't have to cross that bridge at all. Anyway, we're now going to start making a number of passes over Heber. And when I say a number, I mean a lot of passes. This took quite a while to get into orbit, so I'm just going to get skipping through all of them. Thank God for persistent thrust through time warp, this function added by KSB Interstellar. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to make this series if it weren't for being able to time warp while firing an engine. I really hope that KSB2 has a similar system right out the gate. I assume it will, considering it includes a lot of near future technologies, a lot of which have very low thrust to weight ratios. It even has its own daedalus engine, to be fair, as seen in the KSP2 trailer. I mean, I did literally base the Clark off of the ship from the KSP2 trailer, because I thought, oh, I'll put that in the thumbnail, that'll get some clicks, and well, I was apparently right, because the Going Interstellar episode did very, very well for a video on my channel, and brought a lot of new people to the series, something I'm very, very glad about. Anyway, we're finally lowering our apoapsis down to a near circular orbit. We're getting into a roughly 700 kilometer by 700 kilometer orbit, because that is the altitude we need to be at in order to send the shuttle down to the surface. That gives it enough time to decelerate before it hits the atmosphere. And yeah, that is the only way we can send things into Heber. We have to pretty much eliminate all of their orbital velocity, because if they enter the atmosphere any faster than 5 kilometers per second, they immediately explode. So yeah, it's very, very delta V intensive, even just to head down. And all of the fuel on board the Clark is just for that first deceleration burn. The floating colony itself is going to be harvesting carbon dioxide from Heber's atmosphere, as well as the helium-3 and deuterium, and using that to refuel the shuttle once it's landed, and then the shuttle's going to need all of its fuel to get back up into orbit again. Once again, I had some people in my Discord like, you know, why don't you put some refueling things on the platform so you can refuel the plane? I'm like, I am. You really need to use all of its fuel just to decelerate, like just to land. And anyway, we have finally built the colony. It took about 120 days or so to actually construct this thing in low orbit over Heber. And this is the Heinlein, named of course after Robert Heinlein, author of most famously Starship Troopers, although I much prefer one of his later novels called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It has a lot less, you know, glorification of militarism and a little bit of fascist propaganda that Starship Troopers has a little bit too much of for my liking. And anyway, see here, this is what we needed all the liquid fuel and oxidizer for. Having to do all of the staging and fuel flow manually, because unfortunately persistent thrust through time warp, it neglects any kind of fuel flow, so I couldn't use any fuel lines. It just drains all of the tanks evenly while you're time warping, so I just had to do things manually. A little bit annoying, but it's all right. We managed to slow down using 14 of those Z-pinch fusion engines, using liquid fuel and oxidizer, which gives them the highest thrust to weight ratio, I'm pretty sure, of any fuel they can use. Yeah, thrust to weight ratio is very, very important. Gravity losses over a planet this massive are absolutely insane, and even something with twice the ISP but a slightly lower thrust to weight ratio ended up being a worse option. Like, honestly, I experimented with this a lot. You take so many gravity losses on ascent and descent. You really need high thrust to weight ratio to get anywhere. So a lot of people, again, in the Discord trying to help me out, suggesting higher ISP engines and fuels, and they just didn't work at all. But now we managed to slow ourselves down, thankfully not burning up, and we're going to descend into the atmosphere. We activate our atmospheric extraction process, and we begin filling up all of our fuel tanks, which are at the bottom of a massive counterweight, which is necessary to keep the platform stable. And then once it's full, we reach a sort of equilibrium about 40 kilometers away from the, well, quote-unquote sea level. I assume that's just the point at which the pressure of the gas giant would destroy any vessel that dares go that far. Perhaps that's the lair of the Kraken. Considering that, the Kraken really did not like the stuff that we did in this episode. Anyway, once we've got all that set up, you see, we have constructed the shuttle, which I've named the IEV Campbell, named after John Campbell, author of a novella, a little-known novella called Who Goes There, which is what The Thing was based on. One of my favourite horror movies of all time. Actually, one of my favourite science fiction novellas of all time. It's a really, really good read. Anyway, it is powered by 2 massive antimatter powered ramjets and 1 giant Z-pinch aerospike. Yeah, this thing is absolutely insane. Each of those engines produces, I believe, 15 meganewtons of thrust when they're being fueled by the liquid CO2. And that is barely enough to actually decelerate us in time, or accelerate us, in fact, back up into orbit again. This craft is probably one of the strangest looking aircraft I've ever designed in KSP. It took so long just to get it stable. in the atmosphere, because we've got about 10 atmospheres of pressure to fly through, and then it took so much time to tweak this thing so that it actually had enough delta V to get up into orbit. But I'm really quite happy with the result. It looks kind of funky, but it does the job really, really well. You see, we have to retract those air brakes there because otherwise they would have melted off. But thankfully we decelerated enough that we can enter the atmosphere without too many problems. I mean, the deceleration knocks out Katrina. I mean, she gets a bit of a Maneo treatment. If you've seen season 4 of The Expanse, you'll know what I'm talking about. But thankfully she manages to survive. This is why we needed a really, really highly trained pilot. And I believe having a veteran pilot as well increases their G tolerances, because she had higher G tolerance than any other pilot we had in the space program. Anyway, after flying for quite some time, we are approaching the Heinlein, and we have to start lining up our approach. Now, I had to make sure that we were exactly, well, not exactly, but roughly the same altitude, and we had to start decelerating at just the right time and trying to fly as slow as we can. Problem is, I designed this aircraft to be stable at hypersonic speed, so it flies like a brick at subsonic speeds, even on a gas giant. I mean, this thing couldn't fly at all on Solitude. I was testing it. This is designed to work on Heber and only Heber. It's the only planet it works on, and it took a really long time, as I said, to get it working on that. Anyway, we're now making our final approach and slowing it down to 2 times speed here, so you can see I'm just having to adjust it, keeping that prograde marker on the target marker. Trying to lower our altitude a little bit so we're coming in just about horizontal. You don't want to be descending too fast, don't want to hit the platform too quickly, don't want to blow it up after all the work it took to get it here. Slowing down to 1 time speed so you can see this landing in all of its glory. Going in, we've lowered the arresting hook, we've got a few arresting cables to slow our velocity. We land, and the arresting wire pulls us to a very jerky stop. First try! Honest. So after Katrina brings the craft to a stop and undoubtedly has to collect up all of the teeth that got knocked out by that very, very sudden stop, we lower the landing gear and we get her out onto the deck. About 3.25 Gs of gravity at this altitude, so her legs must feel like they are made of lead. It took quite a few attempts even just to get up the ladder and back onto the top of the craft, but we very, very quickly get it fueled up because the Kraken is extremely angered by this testament to Kerbol vanity, and it even rips off our rear landing gear as we take off. So not a particularly graceful takeoff there from the platform, but we managed to get ourselves into the air, get ourselves stable, and begin our ascent using the intake atmosphere, of course, of Heber, so that we can fly pretty much indefinitely, although we are burning through our stores of antimatter quite quickly. You might be wondering where we actually got enough antimatter to power this thing from, and of course the Clark was producing some with its particle accelerators, but it turns out the magnetic field of Heber is ridiculously strong, and contains a lot of antimatter. We have a few antimatter collectors on the Clark, and after spending the 100 days or so building the Heinlein, we actually filled the Clark's antimatter tanks completely. So really, Heber is an amazing sort of fueling depot, not just for fusion fuels, but actually for antimatter fuels as well. I mean, we don't want to be using antimatter fuel to, as a reactor fuel for our colonies. It burns through it way too quickly for my sort of liking. It's very, very, very dangerous to actually store it. But, as a power source for a future interstellar ship, it might actually be viable. Anyway, we make our ascent as high as we can go, actually doing a sort of sinusoidal ascent profile, so we can descend down back into the atmosphere, pick up a bit more speed and have our ramjets produce a bit more thrust, and then go a little bit higher up into the atmosphere. That, of course, produces diminishing returns. So once we get high enough, we switch over to our internal fuel supply, start burning through our liquid CO2, and then we basically have to get out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible, because we're on the clock now that we're burning our own fuel supply. Once our apparatus is actually out of the atmosphere, I swapped over back to the intake air just for a little bit longer, get as much as we can out of that atmosphere, and then we deactivate our main fusion engine, close all our intakes, and swap over to the internal fuel supply. And yeah, this is this is the part where most of my tests failed. It took a long time to tweak this craft so that we had enough delta V to make it into orbit. We need 19.5 kilometers per second in order to get into orbit around Heber, and we cut this really fine. I mean, look at the G's we're pulling. Or this thing is capable of almost 15 G's of acceleration when it's drained most of its fuel. We have to keep throttling them down so we don't turn Katrina into paste. But we finally managed to get into orbit with barely any fuel to spare. So little fuel to spare, in fact, we actually have to rendezvous the Clark with the Campbell. We can't do it the other way around. We have a small inclination change to make. Of course, even the small inclination change around Heber with its ridiculous gravity requires a lot of fuel and really quite a sizable burn from the Clark. But after a few different burns and waiting a bit of time for it to catch up to us, we have ourselves an encounter with the Campbell and we can begin our rendezvous. Yeah, the relief when I finally got into orbit. It took a few attempts actually of different ascent profiles too, ascending at different angles of attack once I swapped over to the carbon dioxide, because of course you don't want to pull up too much because you lose too much of your horizontal velocity, but you don't want to pull up too little, you spend too long in the atmosphere, and even the slightest change in flight profile could save us hundreds of meters per second of delta V. With an atmosphere as thick as Heber's, you have to get it absolutely perfect, and yeah, it took a very long time to figure out how to get up into orbit from that floating platform. As I said, a lot of iterations of this craft. If you go look at my Twitter, I've got a few different iterations on there. It must have been easily 100 different iterations of the Campbell before I got one that worked. And I thought we could get away with like a small little shuttle, but no, it ended up weighing about 650 tons fully fueled. You can probably tell I designed the Heinlein before I designed the Campbell, which is why we had such a short runway to land on. But it managed to all work out in the end, and there we have it. We rendezvoused back with the Clark, brought up our 2 tons of fusion fuel, and we will be making 9 more trips down to the surface before, I say surface, back down to the floating colony before heading back to Fust. But that will be in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed this Kerbal space program, world first. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you all next time.